Hello, welcome to the Friends at Home event. My name is Karen Manuel. I'm on the board of the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. We're delighted to have author Kelly Mustian discussing her book, Girls in the Stilt House, with us this evening, and also Kevis Brownson, a longtime volunteer with the Friends and a book lover who'll be moderating the event. But first, you should know that this is a live webinar, and we'll be recording this webinar. Your audio and video is turned off. Please use the chat to introduce yourselves and to ask questions. And please be respectful in your comments. Friends of the Alameda Free Library is a nonprofit. Our mission is to raise funds and advocate for the success of the Alameda Free Library. We provide these events for free and ask that you consider a donation to the Friends. A donation link will be added to the chat near the end of the program. You can also find a donation spot on our website at alamedafriends.com. So on to our program. I'm happy to introduce Kevis Brownson, who will be discussing the book tonight with Kelly Mustian. Sorry. Welcome, Kevis.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our author to you tonight. Kelly Mustian is the author of the USA Today bestselling novel, The Girls in the Stilt House, which Publishers Weekly describes as a remarkable debut. She is the recipient of the Mississippi Library Association's 2023 Author Award for Fiction. Her upcoming novel, The River Knows Your Name, will be released on April 1st, 2025. And with that, let's welcome Kelly Mustian.
Hello, good to be here. So happy to be with the Alameda Library. Thanks for inviting me, and I hope we'll have a good discussion here.
Great. Well, Kelly, I'm going to start right in and ask you a few questions. You're from Natchez, Mississippi, but not from a swamp.
Right.
What did you know about the swamp landscape and the people who lived there before you started the book? And did you change your perception at all once you started?
Well, I actually, and I do want to say that I did leave Mississippi when I went off to college, and I never moved back there. So I left there at 19, but I know that place in the way that you know the place where you came of age. You really, where you're becoming a person and forming your thoughts and setting your step in life. That happened for me in Mississippi. I lived about an hour and a half from the swampy part of the Natchez Trace. The Natchez Trace is a parkway now, just a beautiful parkway, and it actually runs, it's about 444 miles. It runs from Natchez, Mississippi to Nashville, Tennessee. But back in the day, it used to be what connected the Chickasaw Nation to the Choctaw Nation in the south part, where I was from. And back in the day, it was just a loosely connected group of pathways and old dirt roads and things that had been followed along for 100 years, more than 100 years. It was originally formed by buffalo. So I lived right at the terminus of that trace, the southern terminus of the trace, and I have family cemeteries on the trace. So I was familiar with the swamp. It wasn't as if I didn't know it at all. But it's the book itself is not really meant to be based exactly on the cypress swamp on the trace. It just more that general area. The book in the swamp in the book is fictionalized. It's larger than the swamps on the trace actually are, and there aren't stilt houses on that swamp. So that was an invention. But what I loved about setting it on the trace, the trace is such a rich setting. It's rich in history, and the landscape is just incredibly beautiful. And to set a novel in Mississippi in the 1920s, the trace itself, but especially the swamp, was just the perfect device to sort of explore the contradiction between beauty and brutality, the brutality of the time in that place, and the physical beauty of the setting. So that served me very well. And I'm very connected to the landscape where I grew up. So it's a long answer to that question.
I was curious, was there a reason that you set the book in the 1920s in particular?
You know, I am very at home in the 1920s. The generations in my family are very, I always say, stretched out because people had children, even I did, very late, for many generations. So my sister was old enough to be my mother. My mother was old enough to be my grandmother. My grandmother, who lived into her mid-90s, was old enough to be my great-grandmother. So when they told me stories, my mother and my grandmother would tell me stories about their childhood. They were in the 20s and the 30s, and I constantly asked for stories, and I've always just felt really comfortable there, more than I would writing in, say, the 40s in the World War II era. I'm just at home there. I have because I have so many family stories, I have what I believe is a good sense of the 20s. And of course, I did a ton of research, but yeah, I feel like I could know what to do in the 20s.
So a lot of your book is about things that maybe is a different experience than you may have had growing up. I mean, certainly besides the time period, but different cultures. There's so much, the prohibition and the and midwifery and family dynamics and women's choices. It's such a rich book in telling all these stories. And I wondered if there was something in particular that you wanted readers to learn more about or explore.
There are wonderful books about midwifery in that era, in that time. One thing I tried to do in the book with the midwife in the book, you know, midwives and sharecroppers can be stereotypical in literature, and I wanted to show both of those occupations for the heroic things that they did, for the noble occupation that particularly midwifery was. An example of that is there's a place in the book where Gertie, who is the midwife, has one of her patients, Teensy, hold a carrot, and then she tries to pull it out of her hand. And rather than that being just superstitious or silly, it really was. It was even today, your grip when you're pregnant is a test for preeclampsia. And that's what she was doing. She was testing her grip with the scant resources that midwives in that era, Black midwives had. She used a carrot, but it was effective, and that's what was behind that. I wanted to give some nobility to what might have been seen as a stereotype. But I will say, it was a long journey for me to take on the character of Matilda. I did not want to do that in the beginning, the Black woman, young woman. I wrote the first draft, the first version of this book. She didn't speak until the last chapter. She was a mystery, like she was in the beginning, all the way through the book. And you didn't really know what was going on with her. And I didn't get into her head because I didn't want to encroach. So much harm has been done. I didn't want to cause any harm. I knew that place very well. I knew that landscape very well. I knew the culture of Mississippi. Even when I was growing up in Mississippi, Mississippi changes very slowly, or it did at that time. So I had an understanding of the oppression and the violence that was part of the culture at that time, upheld by laws. But taking on that Black character, I didn't want to overstep and encroach. And my agent read the book, the first version, and he said, you know, I really want you to consider bringing Matilda forward and giving her equal time with Ada. And I really took another entire year to A, decide if I thought that was the right thing to do, and B, to actually decide to do it and get it done. So I left this wonderful New York agent who was just a dream, kind of on hold. And when I finally got back to him and did write Matilda, he said, "Yeah, I wondered what happened to that woman with that book," you know. But that was uppermost in my mind and extraordinarily important to me. And yeah, so I just wanted to say that it wasn't something that I did lightly. So yeah, that was and I have, you know, there are Black children in my family, and I had their faces in my head as I presented that oppression and cruelty, and you know, there were a lot of things swimming around in my head as I was writing this book.
So yeah, that occurred to me because I wasn't sure if you'd started out with this concept of a story of two young women with similar challenges, but from different backgrounds, who'd been living so close together yet apart, and they're thrown together by circumstances, but otherwise they might have lived their lives in parallel without really knowing anything about each other. And then I was thinking about the challenge of trying to write a story where you have to get inside each of their heads, and then they're also hiding things from each other. Mm-hmm. I mean, one character more so than the other, but still trying to develop the story in parallel yet overlapping. And what kind of writing challenges must that have presented?
It was challenging. The primary challenge was my being, you know, wanting to do this right so much. And I can say that growing up in Mississippi, there were some challenges in my childhood. And I lived at the library, which is why I try to never say no to a library. Books were my saving grace as a child. And very early on, I came across an old copy of 12 Years a Slave when I was really probably too young to read that. But it had a vast effect upon me. And that led me to a lot of other narratives by enslaved people, and then to books like the one I always recommend for people who want to understand what Mississippi was like in the past. I always recommend Coming of Age in Mississippi by Anne Moody. She grew up before me, but very close to where I grew up. She actually went to college in Natchez, where I grew up. And she worked with, she knew Martin Luther King, but she worked with Medgar Evers primarily. And if you've ever seen that photo of the lunch counter in Jackson, where they're pouring condiments on people's heads, that she's there at that lunch counter. She's in that famous photo. Her book is just a magnificently written, raw and real look at what Natchez was like. But I read it all my life. I've read a lot of literature written by Black authors, and I always, because of where I came from and what I saw around me, I always paid attention to what was going on around me and tried to understand, and that helped me in doing this. And the books in the library that did set my step in life and kind of formed my worldview was just really helpful. All the voices, the Black voices that I read helped me with Matilda a lot. So that's the best I can say that. And I did have Matilda and Ada in my head from the beginning, but I just didn't write from Matilda's perspective until my agent encouraged me to do that.
Well, thank you. I lived in the library too. In fact, they would let me check out 6 books, I think, max, as a young person.
Yeah.
Every 3 weeks. And so I'd be back there on the dot every 3 weeks. Yeah, I want to remind our audience that please don't hesitate to write some questions in the chat. And also, we talked about you possibly reading a passage from your book or two. So if you'd like to go ahead and do that now.
Sure, I will pull that up, and I'm just going to read on the screen. So I'll set it up just a little bit. For anybody who hasn't read the book, Ada and Matilda are the two primary characters. And Ada grew up on the swamp, and she's a white character. She grew up on a swamp, and she kind of ran away with a carnival worker when she was 14. She was gone for a year, and she has a very difficult father, the kind of father nobody would ever want. He was just a drunk and just unkind, a cruel kind of guy. And she didn't think she'd ever come back, but she found herself with nowhere to go, nothing else she could do but come back. So that's kind of where the story starts after the prologue. And so in this section, she has come back to this house on the trace. Her mother died when she was young. Her father's a trapper, so there's a lot of trapper paraphernalia around. And she's waiting for him to come back, and she's very nervous about it. And she's been there for about 5 days, and he hasn't shown up yet. She doesn't know where he is. So she decides that she's going to take a nap. She's been trying to clean the house up and do everything that she can do to help out. And she decides she's going to take a nap. So this is that scene. It was late when she woke, and she opened her eyes on darkness. Or maybe her eyes were still closed and she was asleep, only dreaming of waking. Drifting through her mind was a faint impression of having been awakened by a soft scuttling sound, and she held her breath, waiting for the squeak of the screen door, the thud of her father's boots on the floorboards, but there were only the ordinary sounds of the swamp at night. She listened for an animal on the porch or mice running under her bed, but there was no sound that matched the one lingering in her head. Even in wakeful daylight, it had become difficult for her to sort out what had really happened in the last year and what she had merely dreamed. Had she really met Jesse? Had he taken her away from the swamp, loved her, or at least told her he had, and believed it at the time? If Jesse was only a dream, he was a dream she welcomed. She closed her eyes again. Sometime later, a few seconds, a minute, an hour, she heard, or thought she heard, or dreamed she heard, the back door close much more softly than her father ever would have closed it. Too weary to open her eyes again and unwilling to shoo Jesse from her dreams, she sank back into sleep, and sure enough, Jesse was there waiting. For once, Ada slept through the sunrise and on into the morning. She slept until her stomach woke her with gentle snarls, reminding her that she had not eaten supper the evening before. Nor had she sealed the cornbread against mice, she realized, and it would almost surely be ruined. She untangled herself from the blanket and shuffled into the kitchen. Halfway to the stove, a quiet panic took hold of her, like a cold hand on her sleep-warmed shoulder. Something was different. She sensed it before she saw it. And when she focused in on what it was, finally, it was not something frightening like a snake or a swamp rat or a stranger peering through the window. It was a pine cone. Only that, one perfect tree-shaped pine cone, set down precisely in the center of the big pine table where there had been nothing before. So that's one scene.
Oh, beautiful.
Thank you.
Yes. You know, the book has very few male family figures in the main characters. It has some male in peripheral characters, but I wondered about the father-daughter relationship and then the absence of a father, and how that affected how the girls acted and what choices they had, and how you wanted to talk about really choices women had in that time period, and running away and coming back.
Right. Just going to make a note here about one thing that reminds me of. But yes, and what was interesting for me was that Matilda, the Black character, her parents were sharecroppers. My great-grandparents and my grandparents were sharecroppers as well, but way back before my time. My grandparents were gone before I came along late. But though Matilda came from such poverty and oppression and in such a dangerous place for all Black people at that time, she had the richness of family. She had a father who loved her. She had a mother that she was so close to. She had Gertie. She had a supportive community. She was rich in that way, and Ada had none of that. And here was Ada with this drunken trapper father, and yet in society, Ada had more power than she ever dreamed that she would have just because she was white. So that was part of that. I consider Stilt House to be a Southern Gothic novel, kind of in the tradition of Carson McCullers or Flannery O'Connor, although I'm not comparing the quality of my work to theirs. They were my heroes as a child. But one hallmark of the old Southern Gothic classic writing is to kind of take a societal norm and turn it around to make a point about society. And I tried to do that with giving Matilda the power in this relationship, this little isolated world that she and Ada found themselves in together. Ada was the one who had the power emotionally in that relationship, although she had no power in the world. So that did really play into their choices. Ada just kind of went along with whatever Matilda, thought was right, because Ada had been so emotionally broken and stripped of choice making, decision making by her childhood. There's a place in the book where Ada thinks that she'd always felt if there was just one person that she could count on, one person that she had in the world, she'd be okay. And she kind of latched on to Matilda in that way. Matilda chose not to accept that role. And that was her choice in a place and a time when choices were few. And then there was my favorite scene in the book is the scene on Gertie's porch when Ada is looking for Matilda and she goes to Gertie's house. And Gertie makes a choice there. Gertie, who's a midwife, who has offered help to Ada and to Ada's child. But there comes a point where Gertie stands on her porch and says no, and decides to not feel like she has to answer this request from this young white woman that she really cares for. But she stands up and says no. So she has choices there that she made again in a time and a place where choices were not as often allowed as they should have been. So that kind of stuff was in my head, probably things that readers don't notice and that readers don't see, especially if they didn't come from a place like that. But those things were important to me to bring out in a Southern Gothic kind of way. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, because to me that was very much a fascinating part of the book, was just the thinking about another time period, and yet women's choices in the world were still struggling for power and agency over our own. And to relate it to even modern times was really poignant to me, thinking about how long women have been struggling with how to move in the world. So
exactly. No, women, white and Black, had so few choices there as far as occupations. Well, in the country, but maybe especially there, choices for women were so few, and there was so little that Ada could do to support herself in her circumstances. And then you consider the challenges that Matilda had on top of being a woman. It was tough times.
Yeah. So I want to remind people to go ahead and ask questions in the chat, and also you mentioned the name of the book was Coming of Age in Mississippi. The author's name was
Anne Moody.
Anne Moody. Okay. I'm typing this in the chat, but I don't think the webinar people can see that, but maybe that can get forwarded.
It's really a fascinating first-person memoir about being right in the thick of the early civil rights movement and the danger that was involved in that, and still a wonderful story. She was a fantastic storyteller, so it will hold you on every page.
Yes. Was there another passage that you'd like to read to us?
Sure. Going to switch glasses here just to make it easier. Okay. This is not a spoiler because in the prologue, Ada and Matilda are burying a body are not burying it, but they're putting it in an old broken tomb. So this is what we work up to, working back to that scene. This is Ada and Matilda driving a wagon, a mule-pulled wagon down the Natchez Trace, which is very wooded and remote and wilderness dirt road. And they have this body hidden under bales of hay in the back of the wagon. So this is them going down the trace. Matilda held the reins. She knew where they were going, what they were about to do, and she had not found it necessary to seek Ada's opinion on either matter. Neither was she compelled to converse as the two of them, the three of them, rode down the back trail. Matilda holding a lantern high over the rough terrain, the mule moving through the night at her bidding. At the end of the trail, they snuffed out the lantern, a thinly veiled half moon giving light enough. They turned onto the trace, headed away from town and toward the old Choctaw boundary where hardly anyone ever had cause to go. They had not traveled far when a large dog raced out of the woods and into the dirt road, barking into the silent night, snarling and snapping at the wagon's creaking wheels. Hellfire! Matilda's breaking her silence seemed to call for some sort of action, so Ada felt along the floorboard for a shriveled apple core Virgil had left there. She flung it over the dog's blonde head into the woods, hoping he would go after it, but he only yipped at it as it flew by. Then, to Ada's horror, leapt into the back of the wagon. She hissed at him and waved her arms, but the dog simply turned a couple of tight circles and curled up contentedly on the bed of hay. Ada scrounged for something else to throw at him, but Matilda said, "Leave him be," so she sat back down. They rode on. The trace narrowed, sunken here between dirt banks that rose on either side, reminding Ada of the parted waves of the Red Sea as the children of Israel passed through them, a story her mother had told her. Recalling it now and remembering her mother and the way she had died made this journey seem less unholy. Her father was dead, and Ada had never felt more alive. She was very nearly buzzing with life, with fear and hope and horror, and something that might be anticipation. A cloud uncloaked the moon, drifting past it in the dark sky, and Ada stole a glance at the strange girl next to her on the driver's seat. This girl she had not known was a part of the world a few hours before, and with whom she now shared something dangerous, a secret that bound them, though neither had earned the other's trust. She hoped there was justice in what they were doing, in what they had done already, that there were exceptions to "thou shalt not kill," or at least mercy enough to cover this night. So there you go.
Thank you so much. Did you think about how to write that, especially that passage where she's exhilarated by the possibilities now opening up to her without the oppressive presence of her father and what that would have felt like. How did you go about imagining that?
Oh, wow. Gosh, well, it's hard to say. You just get into the head of your characters as you're creating them, and they take on a life of their own. I guess there's often a little kernel that you start out with. I know my mother grew up during the Depression. She had, and my grandmother had a tough time growing up, having young children during the Depression. Um, so I guess could start with a kernel of something and imagine this character. You kind of expand some little thought that you have, and you put your characters in strange circumstances. And I don't know, I guess it's just part of being a writer. You get into the head of this character. Um, the villain, Virgil, one of the two villains in the book, I've never known anyone like Virgil. I never had to experience anyone like Virgil, but I can say that what I started with Virgil was something I did know. And that was the idea based on people that I've observed in my life. That was the idea of someone who was so very insecure that he might be motivated by a desire to look like a big man, and yet he's cowardly and not respected, but he can be a big man with his family. And I think that happens a lot in I think that happens more than we realize, that sometimes an unkind father is that way, is motivated because of his own insecurity. And I noticed that in various people in my life. So I wanted to give Virgil a motivation rather than just saying, here's this bad guy, just accept that he's a villain. I wanted to kind of show that that cowardly side of him, where he took people like the sharecroppers who had so little power at that time, and his family, and people who were in a lesser position at that time, so that even he, who was so insecure, could feel some importance. And I think that's kind of, I think that was a very prevalent attitude in the 20s in the Deep South. The whole idea of denigrating Black people to something less than what you were, no matter, if you what you were or how low on the totem pole you might be. There were people who could pump themselves up by thinking themselves better. So yeah, I may be going too far in all of this, but those were things that I observed when I grew up. And I do think of this book as my bearing witness book. So I'm very honest. I try to be very honest about what I witnessed and what I saw in the world. And that's one of the reasons that I decided to go ahead and take on the character of Matilda. I wouldn't take Matilda on in the present day, but I felt like maybe I had something to offer in bearing witness to what I knew about that time in the past, when I grew up there and when my mother grew up there and when my grandmother grew up there. So I tried to be unflinching about presenting that. Although, if you were completely unflinching, it would overwhelm the story. So there's my perspective.
Well, and also it's showing some of the motivation behind how the Virgil acts. Even as wrongheaded as it is, it helps go to the central question of Black and white in our society for these hundreds of years, how it's been, if you're not better than so-and-so, well, then who are you better than?
Yeah.
And so
we all have that temptation in different ways, occupational competition, and there are different manifestations of that. But when you have all the laws set against you, and legally you have no power, and that's a really scary, that goes way beyond any kind of normal competition. becomes extremely oppressive.
Yes, and also like sharecroppers being basically forced to take on maybe illegal tasks that they might really prefer not to be involved in, but having little choice about that because of their position in society. I thought you brought that out really
Are trying
well.
to hold on to some little hope about getting out of that situation when everything was stacked against them. Sharecropper system was sort of like the mill village system where you're so in debt to the sharecropper. It was all set up so that the sharecroppers were so in debt to the landowners, is what I meant to say. Like the old company store with the mills, you can't get out of that without being legally penalized or criminalized because of the debt you owe that is, by design.
Yes, and I thought it was a very good touch to bring in the wealthier family within the system to show how it all worked together in terms of what choices people had.
Yeah.
So I have a question from Lee that says, your depiction of the South is very similar to what I remember in the 50s. It is very interesting how slow the South changed from post-Civil War to 1970s, especially as compared to the growth and change of the rest of the country. I was surprised to realize the story was from the 20s. Do you think books like yours will help speed up change in the future?
Oh, I don't want to take that on myself. I think that the voices that we're listening to today, there's so much more fairness just in the last 5 to 10 years in publishing. There are more diverse voices out there now, and I think that's what's going to change things more than anything. I think my book might help people to understand the early years of the civil rights movement, or even before the civil rights movement, just what everyday life might have been like for people in that time, the basis, the need for change. But the need for change has never gone away. And the voices, the books that you can read now about what's going on now today, I think is what is fostering real change.
Yes. Well, and I've had several questions or comments about, oh, I read the blurb and it says it's like where the crawdads sing, which I know you're not responsible for that. Your publisher is.
I have never read Where the Crawdads Sing.
Right.
I've never read that. So, but that came at, my book came out at a time when Crawdads was just the biggest book going. And, probably I'm not supposed to say this, but, publishing, if you could say that your book is similar to Crawdads, that's a big, big plus. All I know about Crawdads is that it's set on a swamp in North Carolina, and there's a child involved, and that's really all I know. And I'm glad that's all I know, because I get this book brought up a lot, and I'm glad to say I've never read it, so no one can imagine that I was trying to be like Crawdads. If my book is like,
say that most of the comments say, but I read it and it wasn't at all like that.
Oh, great. I love to hear that.
I am so glad that I read it. That is what the comments say,
No disrespect to Crawdads, but you don't want to look like you were copying something else that's been done, so people who find it different, I'm really happy about that.
Yes. So your book, I didn't expect to really be like so suspenseful and a thriller and all the plot twists and turns. Did you start out with that concept that it would be, or did that just sort of happen?
I write blind. I just all I had in my head when I started was this picture of this image of an old broken above ground tomb, the old ones that you see that are cracked across the top. and kind of broken up. And I saw one of those as a child, and it stayed in my head all these years. And I thought, man, you're just so close to whatever's in there. It's very titillating. I had that, and I knew I wanted to set it on the trace. And I knew that if I wrote a book in the 1920s on the trace, I couldn't ignore race, because race was everything. Even when I was growing up there, like your reader said, when I was growing up there in the 70s and the late 60s, race was an issue all the time. It was in the air all the time. So I knew I would have to deal with that. And that's really all I had to go on. It just kind of came as I was going along. But I will say, I've said this many times, I care about language. I am all about analogy and symbolism and wordplay and melodic sentences, lyricism. That's my favorite thing as a reader and a writer. So before Stilt House was the third book I wrote. Before that, I got a lot of my former agent sent my first book out, and I got a lot of things. I remember one of them, but I got a lot of this sentiment: beautiful writing, but too quiet to make a literary splash. That was an exact quote. And I heard that a lot. So with Stilt House, the most important thing to me was beautiful writing. All I really care about is pretty sentences. I just want to write pretty sentences. But I heard that so much that I thought, okay, I'm going to have to make this louder. So I killed a lot of people, and I had a lot of action, and I kept my pretty sentences, but I embedded that in a much more action and plot than I normally would do. And that combination really, really worked well for me. And it did further the story, because it was a violent time, and it was the right thing to do.
Yes, I think your language worked really well in that setting, and to that extent, it's also the swamp itself, and your description of it is such a character, and even a suspenseful character in your book. How did you feel about the swamp being really essential to the plot?
I wanted it to be a very atmospheric book. I wanted to put the reader right there. And again, it's attention to language. I wanted the plop, plop, plop of the snakes falling into the water when it rained and the water rose. I wanted the smells and the feel, because I like that as a reader. I read 95% of what I read is literary fiction. And I'll read anything if the sentences are pretty, if it's melodic and it's beautifully written. That's the primary thing for me as a reader. So yeah, and I will recommend, my favorite book right now is Niall Williams's This Is Happiness. Oh. And the first 75 pages are pretty much about rain, how much it rains and what the rain's like. And I loved it because every sentence was so staggeringly beautiful. So yeah, the swamp was, like I said before, a good device for that. It gave me so many opportunities to use language and to match language to the story, that the foundation of the story.
Yeah, you started talking about the plop, plop, plop of the snakes, and it makes a chill go right up my spine again, even though I can't even remember where that was in the story. But it really brought the atmosphere, and it really brought sometimes the creepiness, of what was going on and what was going to happen, and very atmospheric. So I want to remind people, you have just a few more minutes to ask any questions. So please go ahead and put them in the chat. And my next question is, was it hard to figure out how to conclude your book? with everything that they went through, your characters?
I knew how I wanted to end the book, and I usually don't know how it's going to end. But the one thing I didn't want to do was to tie up this relationship between Ada and Matilda. I didn't want it to be, and they lived happily ever after and were best friends. I felt like that would be disrespectful to the times and to what stood between these girls. Not just the history between Matilda's family and Ada's father, and the struggle there and the wall there between them because of that, but also because of the time. I just am not the writer to put these two girls together. I wanted them to care about each other in the end. I wanted them to hope for the best for each other, and I wanted them to have a a tie because of all they had been through together. But I didn't think it was realistic for them to tie everything up in a happy little. I do feel like the ending is very uplifting, and I do feel like there's warmth and there's caring there. But I just didn't want it to be too easy, and it wasn't an easy friendship. It was fraught with all kinds of challenges, all kinds of injustices. And for them to get where they eventually get is a beautiful and uplifting thing to me. But yeah, I kind of dug my heels in about how I ended the book. And some people love that ending, and some people say, I wish, we always had this wish for the happiest possible unrealistic ending sometimes. But I don't think it's a sad ending. I think it's an uplifting, hopeful, positive ending. But yeah, I really wanted it to end just the way that it does.
Well, and they each are still making choices that are best for each person. They each have more agency than they did in the beginning. So, yes, to me, that's very hopeful. And
that was exciting for both of them, the opportunities that they have, the hope that they have for the future.
Well, I thought your attention to each one of the characters, I mean, the villains and how they were, and the midwife and her family, it left me caring about, I mean, each one, especially the midwife and her family. And so I wondered what you thought about when you were writing her in 30.
Gosh, I have to just give a nod to all the literature I read all my life about, from the voices of actual enslaved people or oppressed people or people going through the early years of the civil rights movement. If I had any hope of doing any justice to these characters in this story, it was based on my own personal experience and witnessing, and of those voices that I listened to. I usually don't say this because it sounds very self-serving, but it was a good thing for me growing up where I did to have had a challenging childhood, because had I come from a different sort of home, a very nurturing, doting kind of home, I might have not had such open eyes about what was going on around me. Maybe I would have. I only know the path that I had, but because I felt a little bit in an unjust situation. Not that my situation was anything horrible. It wasn't. It was emotionally challenging, but I kind of tuned into the overall injustice going on around me, and I'm really grateful for that. It made me empathetic in a way that I might not have been if I had grown up in different circumstances. So I don't normally say that because I don't want that to be an easy, oh, I get to write this book because, it wasn't an easy thing for me, but being attracted to those books and forming empathy and some understanding from the books I read was just allowed me to even think about writing this book.
So, yeah, I have a question from the chat. How much of the underground network was based on historical info? I'm not sure what that means, but
well,
getting
surely
away.
not the Underground Railroad, because that was back in slavery times, and this is in 1920, which is after slavery, but in the Jim Crow era, which was really a different kind of slavery. But so I'm not really sure what she means, but I can answer that in this way. Some of the characters, like the pastor, the black pastor in the Matilda side of the trace, is based is historically accurate in many ways. The pastors were involved, as they probably are today. I don't want to speak to that, but church was a place where people could go and have an understanding within their culture of, or maybe find a haven, talk about things. And also in Jackson, a bigger city, later on in the book, the funeral home director, who was also a black character, there's some historical basis for funeral homes also having sort of an underground role. And you can read about things like that if you search those things out. So the haven that churches and people like the funeral home directors in some places and the newspaper editor, some of that is certainly based in history and is somewhat underground.
Yeah, I imagine in order for people to move about in society, you'd have to have some connections. That then morticians have some advantages in certain ways.
Well, sometimes if you had no one to turn to and the law wasn't on your side, there were people who tried to help.
Okay,
I don't want to act like I'm an expert on that, though.
Right.
Other voices could tell you much more about that.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So, I don't know. Do we have some wrap up things? Anything that you'd like us to know about your book that we haven't talked about? Or I have yeah.
Goodness, only to say thank you to all the readers. This little book has sold so many copies that I'm just gobsmacked by it. So grateful and so humbled, and it's had such a warm reception that anybody who's read it, I just say thank you.
Yeah. So I do have a comment from someone out there. Kay, my mother grew up in Arkansas and would have loved your book. She often told us that she was closer to the family's black maid than to her own mother, and the second-class citizenship she observed always bothered her. I remember her following the civil rights movement intently. So I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people. Now, what about your next book? Is that in a different time period?
That takes place during the Depression, so in the 30s. There's a dual storyline. There's one woman kind of moving forward in the 1930s, and a woman who's an adult in 1971. And those two storylines kind of work toward each other. These women are linked by a catastrophe that happened in 1934. So one woman is trying to find answers about the past, and about some hazy memories that she has about where her little sister came from. She showed up on the porch. She can just barely remember this, and the sister knows nothing about this. She's trying to look into what did her mother do something bad, what's going on. She's working back through genealogical records, and the other woman is living that storyline. And they kind of meet at the 1934 point, and everything becomes clear.
It sounds wonderful, and I can't wait till it comes out next year. It's going to be hard to wait.
There is not a racial theme in this book. Of course, it is in Mississippi and in North Carolina. But the point of the book is not racial injustice. So it's different in that way.
Yes. Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. And yeah, it's been great. People, don't know, Karen, are you going to close the program, or should I? So
let me just say thank you to the library and the Friends of the Library, and I hope that people do donate, because libraries are more important now than ever. So yeah, I'm grateful to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for coming, Kelly. And yes, please, there's a donation link in the chat, everyone, and we wouldn't be able to do this without our wonderful authors and our wonderful friends of the library, and we're so grateful for everyone that showed up tonight. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevis and Kelly, for a wonderful discussion of your book. I loved your book. I read it quite a long time ago and just love it, and have already pre-ordered your next book. So
thank you so much.
I hope others will as well.
Pre-orders are more important than most people realize for the success of a book. Has a great impact.
Oh, good. Can you tell us how that is?
Oh gosh. Well, there's a pre-publication buzz for a book, and how well a book is doing in those months, those few months before publication, has an impact in a lot of ways. As far as, well, I don't want to get too detailed because I'll get over my head really fast, but pre-orders are one of the kindest things you can do for a writer whose work you like. In the success of the book, which leads to whether or not they get to write another book. Yeah, a lot is determined about the book before it's even published.
Oh, that's great to know. And it makes me even happier that I pre-ordered it. So, and I'll do it more now that I know that. I didn't know that. So yeah, thank you so much. So I'm just gonna make some closing remarks here. Besides thanking you, I want you to know that I've added links to the chat for so you can purchase Girls in the Stilt House from an independent bookstore, and they can mail it to you no matter where you are. And I also added links for pre-ordering Kelly's novel, The River Knows Your Name. Our next event is an Art Dozen event on August 14th called Africa Meets the West. It's about the many cultures in Africa and traditions throughout the continent, even cultures that we don't already know about. So I'm looking forward to that. Please consider a donation to Friends of the Alameda Free Library, either through the link in the chat or on our website at alamedafriends.com. Watch our website, our newsletter, and our Facebook page for future events. Many thanks to the people who make this possible: Karen Butter, Beth Curarty, Billy Reinschmidt, and Kumar Fonse. Finally, thank you all at home tonight for spending your evening with us, and I hope we'll see you next time. Good night.